The order sounded simple enough when it moved across the map: go into the forest and bring them out. But in late October 1944, in the cold hills of eastern France, that sentence stopped being simple the moment it reached the men who had to obey it. Ahead of them was the Vosges, a place of wet trees, steep ridges, hidden machine guns, and fog that made a man feel alone even when his whole platoon was near him. Somewhere inside that forest, more than 200 American soldiers were trapped. They had run out of room, almost out of food, and nearly out of hope. The men ordered to reach them belonged to the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, a unit made up mostly of Japanese-American soldiers. Many of their families were still behind barbed wire at home, locked in camps by the same country now asking their sons to save other Americans in France. By the end, the question would not be whether they were brave. The question would be how much a country could ask from men it had not fully trusted. The trapped soldiers were from the 1st Battalion, 141st Infantry Regiment, part of the 36th Infantry Division. They had pushed into the forest during the drive to clear the region around Bruyères and Befontaine. On paper, their movement looked like an advance. In the trees, it became something else. German forces knew the ground, and the forest gave them cover everywhere. Roads were narrow. Slopes broke apart into ravines. A unit could move a short distance, lose contact with the men on either side, and suddenly find itself alone. That is what happened to the battalion. They went forward, then the Germans closed behind them. The line that should have connected them to the rest of the division disappeared. Radio contact was unreliable. Supplies could not reach them. The men dug in where they could and waited while the forest tightened around them. They were not lost because they did not know where they were. They were lost because no one could get to them. For the men inside the pocket, time changed shape. A day no longer meant morning, afternoon, and night. It meant another count of ammunition, another mouthful of cold food if any was left, another attempt to listen for friendly fire that might mean help was coming. The wounded were harder to protect because there was nowhere clean to put them. Leaves were wet, ground was soft, blankets stayed damp. Every sound from the trees could be a branch moving in the wind or a German patrol, or the first sign that the next attack had begun. The men tried to make themselves smaller. They cut into the earth. They listened. They waited. What made it worse was knowing that the American lines were not impossibly far away. Help existed somewhere beyond the ridges. But between the trapped battalion and safety stood a forest full of men who were ready to kill anyone trying to cross it. The men outside the pocket were trapped in a different way. They knew the battalion was still alive, but knowing that did not create a road. Commanders could draw lines on a map and point toward the pocket, yet the map did not show the sound of machine guns hidden under wet branches. It did not show how long a wounded man could lie before someone reached him. It did not show how quickly a rescue attempt could become another group needing rescue. That was the cruel pressure building around the operation. Every hour made action more necessary, and every attempt made the cost clearer. The 442nd had already been fighting hard before the order came. They had helped liberate towns. They had pushed through difficult ground. They had taken losses that would have slowed another unit to a halt. Some of the men had been in combat long enough for exhaustion to become part of their bodies. Their uniforms were dirty. Their feet were sore. Their sleep came in broken pieces. When a man stopped moving, he could feel how heavy his rifle had become. Around Bruyères and Befontaine, they had learned how quickly a village street could turn into a trap. A window could hide a rifle. A cellar could hold men waiting for the next patrol. A hill that looked empty in the morning could be alive by noon. They had not arrived at this rescue fresh, clean, or untouched by fear. They arrived with the look of men who had already paid for every yard they had taken. Yet the 442nd had a reputation that followed them from one battlefield to another. They attacked when ordered. They kept moving when the ground punished them. Officers above them knew this. That reputation became a burden. When other attempts failed to break through to the trapped battalion, the 442nd was sent into the trees. They were not being asked to take an easy road. They were being asked because people believed they would go where others could not. The men understood the meaning of that belief better than anyone. For many mainland Japanese-American soldiers, the war had begun with suspicion at home. Their parents, siblings, and neighbors had been removed from houses and farms, sent to camps, watched by guards, and told in 100 different ways that their loyalty was not assumed. Some soldiers in the 442nd had volunteered while their families lived behind wire. Others came from Hawaii, where the Japanese-American community was large, proud, and deeply tied to American life. They carried different memories, but they shared the same question on the front line: how much proof would be enough? In France, no one had time to talk about that question openly. There was mud to cross and fire to answer. But the question was still there. It sat under every order. It followed them into the forest. If this history deserves to stay visible, a quiet like is enough to help the next person find it. Then we return to the men who had no such distance from the moment. The first pushes toward the Lost Battalion were not clean charges. They were slow, ugly movements through ground that seemed designed to break formation. The Germans had the advantage of height and cover. Machine guns could be hidden in places that were almost impossible to see until they opened fire. Mortars dropped into trees and sent splinters down with the metal. A shell did not need to land directly on a man to wound him there. The forest itself became part of the weapon. Branches snapped, trunks shattered. Dirt and bark filled the air. Men learned to read danger through tiny changes. A bird lifting from a branch. A silence that arrived too suddenly. A slope that forced them to expose their shoulders before they could see what waited above. The 442nd moved in short advances because there was no other way to move. A squad would crawl, pause, fire, listen, then crawl again. Men called for medics, but medics were trying to survive the same ground. Officers looked for a path that did not exist. Runners moved with messages because wires broke and radios failed. Sometimes a man reached the next group only to discover that the message was already too late. Every ridge looked like the one before it. Every small opening looked dangerous because it was. Inside the pocket, the trapped battalion could hear some of the battle without understanding it. A burst of fire might mean rescue was closer. It might also mean the rescuers had been stopped. Hope became dangerous because it rose and fell too quickly. Men began to calculate impossible things. If help arrived in an hour, they might hold. If it arrived tomorrow, maybe not. If the Germans attacked in strength before then, there might be no one left to rescue. Food was low. Water was difficult. Ammunition had to be saved, then spent, then saved again. The wounded were not separate from the story. They were the story because every hour made their chances smaller. Men who could still stand understood that being trapped did not mean waiting quietly to be found. It meant holding a piece of ground with less of everything than the enemy thought you needed. For the 442nd, the rescue became less like an operation and more like a measure of will. They were not simply trying to reach coordinates. They were trying to push through a defense that had already swallowed other efforts. The terrain forced them into places where numbers meant less than nerve. Some men could see only a few yards ahead. Some followed the boots in front of them because that was all the world had become. Orders passed down the line in low voices. A man might hear that the trapped battalion was close, then spend another hour fighting for a few yards and wonder whether close meant anything in that forest. Close could mean the next ridge. It could mean another ravine. It could mean 50 yards that would cost more than the mile behind them. The men had to keep moving through a kind of arithmetic no one wanted to say aloud. One position taken, several men down. One machine gun silenced, another opening from the trees. One wounded man pulled back, two more calling from ahead. The phrase, "Lost Battalion," sounded almost clean from a distance. For the men walking toward it, it meant mud on their hands, smoke in their lungs, and the knowledge that stopping would leave other Americans to die behind the trees. The attack that finally mattered was not grand in the way battle maps make attacks look grand. There was no smooth arrow gliding forward. There were men getting up when their bodies wanted to stay down. There were small groups forcing themselves toward positions they could barely see. There were soldiers firing into muzzle flashes, crawling past wounded friends, and trying not to think about how many had already fallen. Some accounts describe the final push as a kind of sudden fury, the moment when exhaustion broke into movement because there was nothing left to save for later. But even fury did not make the forest open. Men still had to cross ground one body length at a time. They still had to decide whether the shape ahead was a stump, a helmet, or a man waiting with a rifle. They still had to move after hearing a friend make a sound no one could answer. The 442nd pressed forward. German positions began to bend. The distance closed. Somewhere ahead, the trapped men heard American voices. Not a rumor, not a guess. Voices. After days in the pocket, that sound may have mattered as much as any supply crate or command order. It meant the forest had not kept them. When the rescuers reached the Lost Battalion, the scene was not victory in the clean way people imagine it afterward. The trapped men were alive, but they were worn down to the edge. Some were wounded. Some were hollow with hunger and fear. Some had probably stopped picturing rescue as a dramatic arrival and had begun picturing it only as another hour survived. Then the men from the 442nd appeared through the same trees that had seemed to close off the world. It is easy to imagine relief first, because relief is the emotion history wants from this moment. But there must also have been shock. The rescuers were exhausted. Their faces, uniforms, and hands carried the cost of the path they had opened. Some trapped soldiers may have looked at them and understood that the price of reaching them had been terrible before anyone said it aloud. The numbers have been argued and remembered in different ways, but the shape of the cost is not in doubt. More than 200 men were brought out of a place where they might have disappeared. The 442nd paid for that rescue with hundreds of casualties across the fighting around the operation. In some companies, the loss was so heavy that the unit that came out did not resemble the unit that had gone in. The rescue succeeded. That did not make it painless. It made the pain harder to ignore. Afterward, there were ceremonies, reports, and words that tried to hold the meaning of what had happened. But reports are poor containers for this kind of thing. They can record a date. They can count men. They can name a unit and place it on a line of advance. They cannot fully explain what it meant for Japanese-American soldiers to be ordered into that forest while their families at home lived under suspicion. They cannot explain what it felt like for a trapped Texan soldier to see rescuers arrive who had every reason to know that America had not treated them equally. They cannot explain the quiet after the first relief, when the living had to count the cost and discover which voices were missing. They cannot explain a roll call where a name is expected and only the forest answers. Even praise can feel strange after something like that, because praise arrives clean and late. The men who survived had mud on their boots, grief in their bodies, and memories that would not arrange themselves into a speech. A rescue can be glorious from far away and unbearable up close. The Lost Battalion rescue was both. There is a reason this story still holds power. It is not only because the 442nd became one of the most decorated units of its size and length of service in American military history. It is not only because the Lost Battalion survived. It is because the story forces a country to look at two truths at the same time. The first truth is that these soldiers fought with extraordinary courage. The second is that courage should not have been demanded as proof of belonging. They were Americans before the forest. They were Americans when they entered it. They were Americans when they bled there. What changed was not their loyalty. What changed was the number of people forced to recognize it after the fact. That difference matters. If the story is told only as a proof that they were worthy, it quietly accepts the insult that they needed to prove it. If it is told only as injustice, it risks flattening the agency and skill of the men who fought. The harder truth is the fuller one. They were soldiers, not symbols. They were citizens, not guests. They carried anger, pride, fear, duty, and love for people who were waiting behind fences. That is why the story should not be softened into a simple tale of bravery. Bravery is there, but so is injustice, and the two belong in the same frame. For the men of the trapped battalion, survival did not erase what they had endured. For the men of the 442nd, reaching them did not bring back the friends left on the slopes. War often turns human beings into numbers because numbers are easier to carry. 211 rescued. Hundreds lost or wounded. A regiment decorated. A battalion saved. But inside those numbers were men who had letters in their pockets, families waiting for news, private fears they never wrote down, and memories that did not fit inside official language. A man can survive a forest and still spend the rest of his life returning to it in his sleep. Another man can be called a hero and still remember the face of someone he could not help. That is the part history often lowers its voice around. The order had sounded simple enough. Go into the forest and bring them out. But by the time it was over, the order had become a test of almost everything a soldier can carry. Duty, anger, fear, loyalty, and the terrible knowledge that doing the right thing may still destroy the people who do it. The 442nd went into the Vosges because men were trapped and because an order had been given. They came out with the Lost Battalion, but not whole. That is why this rescue should not be remembered as a clean miracle. It was a human exchange made in mud, smoke, and winter light. If one detail from this story stayed with you, write it below. Not because the dead can hear it, but because silence is how stories like this disappear.